You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good afternoon. Today is Friday, February 7th. I am Assistant News Director Justin Mitchell. And this week marked 2 years since the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, which we all remember the iconic images of plumes of smoke and fiery explosions and very, very tense moments immediately afterward, followed by questions, some of which we've been able to get answers for and some of which we have still not gotten total answers for. Whether it be what the people of East Palestine want and what they need, what the promises from the politicians are, and what has been done to improve safety. Spoiler alert, not much, which we've looked into. So what we're going to do today is to reflect back on that night, as well as all of the work in the 2 years since, and what we still need to work on with regard to the community of East Palestine and the overall safety issues. And so with us is Derek Steyer, who was here that very night. Madison Tromler, who's been there since the beginning and who has looked deep into rail safety and legislation, among other things, and spoken to health experts. And Corey McCrae, who's also been on the ground floor with this since the very beginning and got then Norfolk Southern CEO to make a startling admission that made national news in the days following East Palestine. So guys, I guess let's start that night and just talk about, and Derek, I'll start with you because you were here with Sheila Miller that night trying to coordinate. So I remember a very slow Friday, leaving, going to get, food that night and thinking, wow, this was a slow one and we're exhausted. And then waking up a little bit later to not that.
No, not at all. It was a slow Friday night, and I don't exactly quite remember if it was 9:30, 10. It was around that time frame when we started hearing reports and getting some news in that there was a train derailment down in East Palestine. Weren't really sure exactly, how bad it was. But slowly, every few minutes, you kind of got the feeling this is going to be something big. So we originally sent one crew down there. And then I remember our photographer, Ron Martin, hitting me back either on a text or a phone call and saying, you need to get another crew down here. This is bad. And then we started to kind of get some pictures and video of what we were seeing. And you started to see, the flames off in the distance. And Ron is right up there with the law enforcement who are trying to knock on doors and evacuate. We start to hear now we're evacuating a 1 to 2 mile radius. Still weren't able to get close enough to see, I guess, just, the mass destruction like we've seen since we had our 21 News drone up and we were able to see just how widespread it was. But I can remember I can't believe it's been 2 years. It feels like it was almost just yesterday. And we sent Chris Serenelli down. We sent Aaron Simonek down right after we anchored the 11 o'clock news. We're like, you know what? We need to get all hands on deck here.
Yep.
Let's get some more people down there. And I remember being in the newsroom till about 2, 3 a.m. kind of once we had the initial coverage, I guess, planned. But it happens just so fast. I think we had a live shot in the 11, maybe a little bit more. But other than that, it really started to explode, of course, as it went in overnight.
And those moments are, there's a weird kind of intuitiveness where you realize it's a big, I've covered train derailments before. I remember one in Newton Falls a number of years back. And they're not always big stories. Sometimes they're one-day big stories.
Yeah.
So that information starts to come in where you just kind of realize that this is a bigger deal. And when that happens, you start to think of all of what the questions are. So we know we always call it the nuts and bolts story. This is what we know happened. Right. And then there are the angles that sprout up afterwards. What do we need to know? So one of the things right then that I recall, because for me, I remember picking this up very early Saturday morning. Okay. So like I said, I had gone to sleep on Friday. I woke up to a text from Sheila to me and our then news director, Mona Alexander, saying, listen, I hope you guys are asleep right now, but here's what we have in motion and here's where it's leaving off. And so then I jump in, and then Mona jumps in, and we start talking to crews, and there's news conferences all weekend. And one of the early questions was, what was this train carrying? Because this is a bigger deal than what I've seen before, where it's, there's wreckage to clean up. We're not hearing of any casualties, so why is this a big deal? So Corey, I'll go to you next because you were here that weekend. I was not, well, we'll get to that. I was in the newsroom on Sunday. I wasn't in the newsroom on Saturday, but I was helping to coordinate coverage. Actually, oddly, one thing, guys, is in the newsroom or in the news business, sometimes you're multitasking to an almost superhuman degree. So at one point, my grandmother was in the hospital that weekend, and I was coordinating coverage from a hospital room while nurses were going, "What's he doing?" What I recall, Corey, was my one memory of that day is, first I remember a news conference in the morning that Janet Rogers was at, where she had spoken to some hazmat experts, already had an idea of what was on these trains, and had very insightful questions that were blowing everybody else in the room out of the way, or out of the air, because they hadn't done the research yet. And then the NTSB came in, and we had to get you down there to do a news conference with them, very on the fly, needed to stream it, couldn't even get access to the stream in time because of just how fast it was happening. So talk about that. Talk about where your head's going and what you're trying to find out right up to the wire that day.
Yeah, I think, we had a lot of impromptu conferences. Jennifer Homendy was down there with the NTSB. At that point, Norfolk Southern, their officials hadn't even touched the ground yet. So definitely a lot of questions, and you had local officials, and I can sympathize with almost anybody in an official-like standpoint who just signs up to be a mayor who would never have an idea that this would happen to their village, city, and it was just, and you never knew when they were going to be. When they got new information, they tried holding them very quick. You had to be on edge. You had to know, okay, like, hey, you had to be at the municipal building here, or hey, you had to be, in this location up at the city park, depending on where those conferences were had. But there was still a lot of questions on, okay, this initial evacuation, is it safe for people to go home at that point? Because then there's still questions over what questions, like you said, were what was on that car, and what do these chemicals do? What is the short-term effects? What are the long-term effects? And a lot of that didn't get answered for such a long time. So I know that same weekend, even just about prior to that vent and burn where they had that mandatory evacuation, there was a lot of gray area for folks where it was like, okay, like I have no idea. Like we were the conduit to information for people. People were hanging on every word that we were saying, whether it was where to go. Some people didn't know that they had to go, up West Grand Street to get to the high school up there to be. Some people, had no idea that there was even an evacuation in place. So I think it put a lot of pressure on you as a reporter to make sure that, like, hey, these people, like what you're telling these people matter, because in a village like that where, it's a city, it's different. If it's a Columbus, if it's a Cincinnati, right, anybody can go on and you're going to get a lot of reach to people. But like in a village like that, like people are just, it really goes back to the importance of journalism and being able to be on top of stuff, knowing when things are going on. So just as I'm like kind of rambling through these things, that's exactly what my mind was doing when I got on the ground down there.
Yeah.
Just a lot of information.
Well, because there was, I don't want to say, I guess I'll say mixed information coming from the authorities. And I don't mean that, at least initially, I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that it was unclear exactly how serious things were going to be, because what I recall after getting through that Saturday was that they were doing a news conference that Sunday, I believe at noon. And then they said, everything is status quo. We do not anticipate doing another one of these until Monday at noon. If that changes, we'll let you know. And everybody breathes a little sigh of relief going, okay, well, we're containing this. They're going to put the fire out. It's going to, we're kind of coming out of this, we think. And then I get a call Sunday evening from one of our producers saying, listen, I need help here. The EMA is calling, and they're saying that they're going to call an emergency news conference. They want it carried on air. And they're asking if we can do that as opposed to just a live stream. And they haven't really said what it's going to be yet. But, and this is a tricky thing because normally you can't make a decision without enough information. So why do you want us to carry it on air? Well, in a moment like this, when it could be life or death, you've got to err on the side of caution without panicking, scaring the hell out of people. So we agree, okay, I mean, we're talking to the news director, we're talking to the general manager. It's a no-brainer at this point that we're going to carry it on air, but we don't know what they're going to say. So now I'm at home and I'm cooking, and I had just finished making a bowl of soup, and I run out the door drive into the station with soup in my hand, right? I just remember, because it's like that, right? And they announce at this news conference that they think that these cars the word is polymerization. So basically, the pressure is rising and they could explode. So they're saying that the danger of catastrophic failure is increasing, and this evacuation that had been talked about as sort of a, you really probably want to get out of here, was now we will charge you with a crime if you don't get out of here. If you keep your kids here, we will charge you with child endangering. You have to go. Saying that these cars could blow, and we don't know where this is going to head. Okay, but we go with what we have, and we've talked to some experts by this point, and they're explaining what polymerization is and what the dangers of this could be. So now we get into Monday, and my memory starts to get a little fuzzier at this point, because there's so many all hands on deck. But Madison, I know you were down there then that Monday.
Yes.
And at some point during the course of that day, we get, the governor's in town, and several federal agencies had been on the ground that night, which is just something I state over and over again, because when we get into the politics of this, people have been completely dishonest about who was there. Tell me about that day then coming in Monday.
So I was at the press conference when the governor announced that they are doing the vent and burn, and when they announced the radius and telling everyone to evacuate. I'm pretty sure I was there. So,
and the governor said, if you stay, you will die, essentially. I mean, he used, I think, those exact words.
Yeah,
he did use those words.
I think that was a pivotal moment just in this whole situation, because it was also, looking back in retrospect, that vent and burn is one of the main reasons people still have the long-term health concerns. But it was also pivotal because they made this decision, and I think there was a sense of concern and fear. The governor was going off of the information that he had at the time. That's what he, continued to say, and same with the officials. But, at the time, they said that they felt that this was the best decision to release the chemicals, and we later found out, not to jump ahead, but we later find out that experts are saying, no, you did not, and government officials saying, no, you did not have to do that vent and burn. So, that was really the big moment where, and that's obviously the famous plume photos and stuff. That was really the big moment, I think, after the derailment was, okay, now we're gonna get rid of this tank. And shortly after that, the trains were able to continue doing business. But I think
that press conference Monday was at what noonish morning? Was it early?
I think it was the morning. I just remember being there, and I remember DeWine announcing it and saying, and it was like going to be quick.
And then the vent and burn was like around 3, I think.
Yep.
Something like that. Everybody was still in the newsroom. Nobody had gone home from dayside yet.
And we ended up going, I think we were out of the radius. We had to be.
We would not be putting you guys in the radius.
But I remember being, out of the radius, but enough to, see it and everything.
And they talked about how you'd hear that explosion and that boom when it happens.
Yeah.
And
it was
see the plume from outer space.
Yeah.
There have been satellite photos from outer space
Eric
that showed
picked it up on radar.
Yeah, and I think in the moment, everyone was like, this is like life or death. Like, this is what has to happen. And I think, at least from my perspective, and I haven't covered, any other derailment before, but obviously this one was a lot more catastrophic. But I was like, okay, this is what they have to do. This is, gonna save people's lives, because we thought it was gonna explode.
Well, and they talked about shrapnel that would go flying and how it would be like setting off, a toxic bomb. But what they did was also setting off a toxic bomb, because I remember my perspective, particularly looking at it. I didn't know if there was another way to do it. Nobody was an expert at that point. But you couldn't look at that and think that it could possibly be safe. Might have been the least worst option, which was another one of the phrases that were bandied about. But then, you mentioned Eric picking it up on radar. The smell from this was causing evacuations for miles around in every direction. There's no way that was okay. Even if it was true that it was the least worst option. I remember being sick to my stomach thinking this is I just watched, at the very least, I just watched the earth take a hit that she shouldn't have to take.
Yeah, I was gonna say it almost felt like we knew this was planned, but it almost felt like something went wrong when you were watching the video. It was almost just wait a second. It was almost like,
this be what
and
they're
everyone,
supposed to do? Right.
and I'm sure that was in the minds of everyone. I mean, I'm sure DeWine was like, oh my gosh, it was just kind of one of those things where we're this is just wild, and we just. And right when that was happening, we immediately started hearing from people about how that was going to cause contamination.
Right. So then that's a pivotal moment where it starts to take on another tone. So at that point, we're out of the quote breaking news of it, which usually breaking news is a few hours. So we're already days into breaking news mode, which is breakneck pace, and it's exhausting, and it requires a lot of thinking on the fly. So now is when we can start thinking about the implications of what we've just been through. So we start lining up experts who can tell us about these chemicals. An early expert was a former Youngstown Fire Battalion chief named Silverio Caggiano, who referred to this as nuking a town with chemicals. And at the time we thought, well, that's pretty hyperbolic. I mean, to the point where we actually were standoffish about using him for a little bit until we knew more. People started talking about they were getting rashes, they were having trouble breathing. There were a lot of issues that people were talking about having. And then the governor comes back. So that was on Monday, the vent and burn. Tuesday was, I think, just sort of updates on how that went. Wednesday, the governor's back. And after a long delay, there's a news conference where we don't know what they're going to say. But there's no way that it could possibly be everyone can come home now, right? And it was. That was what they announced then. Less than 48 hours after they did this vent and burn. So now we really have to start thinking about, we're in the trust but verify business. So the authorities are saying this is safe. But I want to know what the experts are saying. And the governor's not an expert. The fire chief, the mayor, these are not people who are trained for this. None of these people are trained for this. We need real experts. So we start searching far and wide. We had an environmental science expert from Kent State, a water and soil expert from Kent State, and then I think we had experts from Ohio State, and eventually we got involved with a former EPA administrator, Judith Enck. And anybody can jump in on this. I know, Madison, you talk to them a lot.
There's
but
so
what do they
many,
have to say?
Am I wrong, though, that they initially weren't testing the air quality and the water?
Right,
It
yeah.
felt weird. We had to push for
yeah.
that.
That was the huge critique from experts and people in the village saying, why didn't it happen immediately? Because there was criticism over the fact that not testing it immediately to the best of their abilities everywhere that they can. Means that it dissipates, but they may not know in the groundwater where those chemicals go. So, and I just, repeat what I've heard from experts. So I know it's really complicated, and I don't want to, say the incorrect thing. But when that happened, people immediately started, as you mentioned, Justin, saying that they were having all these issues. And I remember just days after, it must have been after they allowed people to go back home. But I interviewed this young girl. She was maybe 23. And she had, issues going on like rashes and stuff like that. And we did an interview. But yeah, immediately people were questioning transparency and wondering why more testing wasn't being done. And
we were getting these numbers, and we were like, I don't
How
even
do you
know.
make
How do you make heads or tails
right.
of these
Yeah,
numbers? And that's why we had to search out these experts.
Yeah, and the experts were also questioning the methods they were using and saying that they weren't testing for the entire suite.
Right,
And we were all remember dioxins. That was the first thing I wrote down on my list when I'm thinking of what I covered most. I think of that the most because I remember the EPA Region 5 director, Deborah Shore, she essentially, they were telling us, when I had asked a question in a news conference, they said because there's no baseline, they weren't testing for dioxins.
Right.
Which
and
is,
so that was the famous word she used was ubiquitous. Dioxins are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, so you can't get a baseline. She made references to a backyard barbecue. There's
Correct.
dioxins
Yes.
from that. That was her big line. Well, now in journalism, it's not our job to know things, it's our job to find things out. Meaning we're not any more of an expert than the average viewer. We just have the time to dedicate to think about what we would need to know. And so when you hear them say that, it sounds like a reasonable answer if you don't take the time to think about it. But we're sitting here going, well, now wait a minute. Yeah, they're everywhere, but you could still measure the levels. What is stopping you from going, say, over to Nagley or St. Clair or go down to East Liverpool or come to Mahoning County, and get a baseline and then go to East Palestine and see how they compare? And they never had a good answer for that. They just quietly backed down and started doing dioxin testing after being pestered for months.
Right. Well, yeah, and I was immediately like, oh, that's not what's required of them. Because if they were to start testing baselines everywhere, I mean, that's information we don't even know about how much dioxins are in our area on a daily basis. So, yeah, I mean, from there, people just continue to voice concerns and continue to complain that the EPA is not doing enough testing and that they're not being fully transparent. And we've heard since then from numerous homeowners, residents in East Palestine, how some people have gotten their own independent testing. And even, I know at least one woman, she told me that it was a year ago, but I think even more recently than that, people have found dioxins in their yard and stuff. And people who don't live right next to the derailment site, but people who live in the more rural area of East Palestine, within the 2 mile, maybe like a mile and a half out or 2 miles, they, to this day, some of them say they've never gotten well water testing that they said Norfolk Southern had promised and said they kept calling. So there is just this continued concern from residents saying that they want to move away, but they also can't. They wish that they could get the money and move away. And really quick, also, the mayor, who I was just asking the other day, I was like, do you feel confident? Because I was like, I'm sure you live super close. And he says yes, and that he's gotten the testing that he feels, confident with. And he told me, yeah, we did have some headaches and stuff in the beginning, but it just seems like it's more of just the residents who are like, no, like this is not okay. And, they just don't feel like enough is being done for them.
And so that was the beginning of a long stretch where we'd get information, but routinely it would either have holes in it or things that were, deliberately or not, they were either incomplete or misleading. And this is not from any one source, this is from all of them. So this is from the EPA, this is from Norfolk Southern, this is not lies, but you couldn't just take it at face value, because every single time something came out, you'd go, well, wait a minute here. And the first one of which that I remember was a big one, and this is well before we knew that the vent and burn wasn't necessary, which we'll get to in a moment, is they got those trains rolling really quickly thereafter. So Corey, you get to talk to Alan Shaw, who was the CEO of Norfolk Southern at the time, and ask him about laying those tracks down and how could they possibly have cleaned up all this soil. So talk about that, because this ended up becoming a really key moment in all of this coverage.
Yeah, I think I almost had to backtrack a little bit, because when you're down there a lot, you talk to residents, you're talking with people, who own farms, who are worried about, their soil, worried about being able to do that, worried, like she said, a lot of people live with well water down there. So kind of tagging on to what she said. And then a lot of them kind of wondered a week after that derailment. Norfolk Southern had, rails up and trains running again.
It was the following weekend.
It was
correct?
the following
That's
weekend.
what I thought.
Running, yeah.
And you could hear them coming through town. And I think just anybody in the right mind's like, man, we just had a derailment. We're already hearing trains going through town again. So at that point, Alan Shaw wasn't the first interview either, because they had another gentleman down there who was like a spokesperson. They had a couple public information officers down there that she had to talk to, but he might have been down there a day or so before we had that interview. And Big question at that time was this soil that they were excavating, where were they taking that soil to? Because no disposal facility wanted to take that soil in. I know they talked about like Heritage down in East Liverpool, and then there's a big uprise about that, just taking soil that wasn't contaminated. But at the time, nobody wanted to take that chance. So with that being said, Shaw didn't answer the first question of which, where's the soil going? Because the guy that I had talked to prior to him had talked about the next step was to take this soil and then send it out, ship it out, whether it was going up to Michigan or somewhere of that nature. Well, he wasn't aware, of that. So I backtracked a little bit. I was like, okay, well, you had trains up and running, the next day. So did you find any contaminated soil underneath those rail lines? Because I'm assuming that's ground zero. That's where you're going to find it. Right. And, to which he, in a roundabout way, was like, oh, well, we worked with the EPA to make sure everything was okay. So that was like the cat out of the bag. Okay, so if you worked with the EPA, which you just brought them into this too, that tells me you tested this. So, that's the point blank question. Okay, did you test underneath the rail lines? And it was just like, I didn't say that. And that was, that was kind of one of a microcosm of some of the concerns that whether it was lie by omission or concerns that stuck with people. And I think when you see how people are impacted, when you're down there and you get to see them, like these are people who, it's easy for us to, we can go down there, we can leave. But when you live down there and people who have businesses, that's their livelihoods turned upside down, you could understand why maybe a check or a word from somebody from Norfolk Southern isn't going to hold the salt, that maybe other people might believe. So definitely a lot of questions with that.
But didn't our reporting get them to pull the tracks up and
they did almost immediately.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
Because they had indeed laid tracks over contaminated soil.
Correct.
So now there's a whole new focus here, which is everybody seems to be really quick to want to get back to making money and quit talking about who did what and who made what decision. It's our job to be skeptical and start questioning that, and they gave us at this point plenty of reason to. We've got experts saying that the testing is not wrong, but it's incomplete. We've got them laying tracks on contaminated soil. We've got a vent and burn that they say was necessary, but is always it was just a pit in the stomach kind of a thing. So we've got to keep pressing on this. And now they're telling everybody to just go back home. It just felt like a rush. And another thing that sticks in my mind is that they were not immediately cleaning up those creeks. And I remember Dr. Kuldeep Singh from Kent State telling us early on, you've got a matter of days. These chemicals are heavy. And if you don't clean those creeks immediately and they get into the ground, they sink, they go further, they end up in the aquifers. This can be a bad situation. Doesn't have to be, but you have to work quickly. So looking ahead, we're weeks on, we're months on, and we're still seeing that sheen on the creeks. And I'm not sure that there's not still. I'm really not positive. I haven't seen anybody check it in a while, but every time I'd ever seen anybody do that thing that, J.D. Vance did it, but others did it too, where they stir the water, you see a sheen come up. Listen, if somebody's going to tell you that everything is fine and progressing well, then they have to explain that, and they just weren't. So what were some of the experts saying we should be watching for at that point? Because we're certainly not chemical experts now.
Well, the experts were a little bit confused as well. With some of the data that I would give them, they felt there were holes in the information. They were like, I can't really, and I can't remember the exact wording, but long story short, they felt that the data had holes in it, and it was really confusing. Sure. And that was something I kept questioning is, are you guys able to make this easy for people to understand and verify exactly what the equipment is that you're using, what exactly you're testing, what it is that you're doing, everything. And I just remember experts saying, they didn't do it early enough, they're not doing it enough, they're not doing it widespread enough, they could be using better technology, they're not testing for all the possible chemicals that there could be, the ones that are most concerning, like ones that are cancer causing, really, and the chemicals that are created from the vinyl chloride.
Right, I recall them doing a lot of testing for vinyl chloride and acting like when it's burned, there aren't byproducts
Right.
that they
So
weren't
that's-
testing for, which
that's-
were the dangerous chemicals.
Yeah, that was the whole thing, was once the vinyl chloride was burned, that was the whole concern, was all the chemicals that come with it, along with, the chemicals from the vinyl chloride itself. But really, it's the creation of other chemicals from that, So, so that was the concerns from the experts, and
It felt like it went air, soil, and then water. It was like
Right,
it wasn't
where-
all three of them. It went
right.
right away.
And the thing about the air is that, from what I've learned, it dissipates the quickest.
Right.
So it's not like, when you're walking in East Palestine, as we know, I'm sure a lot of people realize this, but it's not like, you're just breathing it in. Maybe at first, like when the fire was happening, that's why they made or when the vent and burn, that's why they made everyone leave. But really, the long-term concern that I believe, based on the information I have verified from experts and what we know, is that the chemicals are believed to stay in the groundwater for
Right.
years and years and years to come.
Yes.
And, in a lot of areas around here, from what I've learned from the past, we've had a lot of industrial businesses here, and a lot of people, my understanding is that may not realize a lot of our cancers that people get, like prostate cancers and things like that, a lot of people believe is from different manufacturing from before that. So the issue with that, though, is that because there's not enough health studies residents are concerned about being done, is that they won't, be able to draw a connection necessarily
Right.
between, there was this derailment, years ago, and now I have cancer, and so does my husband, and so do my kids, or this and that. And it's not just cancer, but it's reproductive issues. And
those are things that don't show up right away. So we're going to jump around a little bit because I want to get back to that, but that'll be, I think, a little bit later in this when we look ahead at what we still don't know and what the people still haven't gotten. But I think the next couple things to address were, first of all, the NTSB issues their preliminary report, and then they ultimately come to town and they hold hearings for a couple days. And this is where it comes out that rising pressure in those cars was an absolute myth, that the pressure was dropping and it had never come anywhere near the level of being in imminent danger of an explosion. And we still have never gotten a satisfactory answer as to why that was not communicated to the right people. All we've ever really gotten is people, quite frankly, scapegoating the fire chief because statutorily he's the one who makes the call on the vent and burn. But he makes the call based upon the information he has. The experts around who should have known did not say that.
who worked for Norfolk Southern.
And who worked for Norfolk Southern. And also, not to sound conspiratorial, but there's a long gap where Mike DeWine and Alan Shaw are in a room together before that decision was made. And there's no transcript of what they were discussing, but we know that when they came out of it, this decision was made. Now, I don't know. Could have just been, man, Mike, this is a rough one. Yeah, let's hug it out, bro. I don't know. But the timeline begs a question. And then, Derek, you went to Livingston, Louisiana,
Right.
which bore great parallels about 40 years prior.
Yeah.
So talk about that.
Yeah, that was a really interesting trip because I believe it was 1980 in Livingston, Louisiana. There was a train derailment. That one was more human error. The stories you heard about that one, the conductor or engineer on the train picked up his girlfriend at the bar, and they were drinking, and all kinds of stuff was going on, and they failed to hit the brakes. But needless to say, train derails, and very similarly carrying a lot of the same type chemicals. That one, though, they had one of the train cars exploded and exploded and went like 50 to 100 yards away. And so just in talking to them there, it was just so very similar. They did not do a vent and burn. But I remember them talking about the concerns over these cars and the pressurization, the polymerization inside the cars and everything. But it was really just so similar to what happened here. And so we learned a lot. They talked, one of the retired judges down there that I talked to said that he thought one of the biggest things East Palestine could learn from them was this long-term health monitoring, and basically putting a plan in place to be able to understand long-term health consequences and be able to track people's health history who were around this derailment, and see what may have led to anything down the road. There was a settlement, just like there was with East Palestine, a lot less money down there in Louisiana, but he really wished that they would have been tracking it as the way experts are tracking it here.
And every first responder that responded to that scene died of cancer. And they don't know
Or most of them.
why, or if it were most. Well, I'm not sure exactly the figure, but a lot of them died of cancer.
Right.
And that may or may not be related, but the lack of that long-term study
For sure.
is something that they said, listen, you don't want to not know that in East Palestine.
We know the people from 9/11 have all, you know, I mean, so I think, yeah, I think that is important to think about those things, that the people that have died of cancer, you know.
Because that gets into what the people of East Palestine want. We've talked about there being a settlement. Yeah, I mean, there are a couple settlements. The village of East Palestine settled with Norfolk Southern for $22 million. And then there's a $600 million class action settlement. And then there are just a bunch of new lawsuits that were just filed this week, separate from that. But $600 million, even while it is a historically large settlement, doesn't cover cancer treatment for a village that could potentially need it, or some catastrophic medical illness if it arose and could be tied to the derailment 10 years down the road. So it's more than just monitoring. They want to know that through no fault of their own, they're not going to face ruin if there are medical issues related to this. So, I mean, anybody can talk about this because we've all talked to people who live down there about what they're afraid of and what they want. So just, you know, jump in. What are the people, are they satisfied now? Some are, I know, but...
Right.
I think, I mean, rail safety is kind of the big thing that it's been the big question. And, you know, J.D. Vance and, you know, at the time, Sherrod Brown were really the first people on a federal level to be able to bring some kind of bipartisan legislature, but that's still hung up. And the question is, okay, well, this could have been prevented. And I remember being down there when Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, came down to see, you know, what caused this, all to find out that an overheated wheel bearing that could have been checked by a wayside detector that, you know, wasn't in the right place, or weren't enough of them at the right time. So it's, if you're someone that's living down there, you've heard Norfolk Southern say a number of times that, you know, it's, you know, we want to make sure safety is a paramount thing, but it's one of those things where there was a lot of deregulation when it came to the railroads years ago, and now it's paid the price. Now people have paid the price for that, and I think until that kind of resolves itself, that's going to be something that really, you know, hangs around in people's minds as this happened. But what guarantee is this? You know, what have we seen? You know, sitting right in front of us, do we see more wayside detectors? Do we see more maintenance? Do we see a lot of those things? The profit over safety, you know, it's a concern that a lot of people have had. What changes? How do you know that this won't happen again?
And how do you know that it's not just window dressing? Because some of the things that they've announced are things that wouldn't have directly had anything to do with the derailment. I remember there was some state-of-the-art like AI hot box detector that they unveiled.
And it was already invented.
It had already been invented. They were actually one of the last railroads to come to that technology. So they were acting like it was a big step forward, but it was actually a baby step behind everybody else.
Yeah, and I think, so I think the two big things are, before I talk about the regulation, number one, people, I think, and it kind of took me a while to really think about this and realize this, because you wouldn't think people would want to leave and move away, but when you really think about it, there's multiple people I've talked to who are like, we don't want to live here anymore, but we don't have that option to leave. And also people's homes, there is a stigma in East Palestine. So I think, you know, when it all comes down to it, you know, now, I mean, if we're going to think about the testing that wasn't done, you know, apparently in the beginning, right? I mean, that's not going to fix anything now. So I think we're like, we don't want to live here anymore, because if there are contaminants that continue to be in the water over time, a little bit of exposure is a concern. So I think people are just like, you know, they should pay for us to get rid of our house or pay for our home and get us to move. Or, you know, people have even said they should build over this entire village. And things like that have been done before in other communities in similar instances.
Well, another thing that's been done before, at least in one community, is that there is a provision in the Affordable Care Act that allows for a declaration to be made that would provide essentially Medicare for all for that village for that reason. And it hasn't been done, and it's something that some are still calling for. I do want to interject and say that I do think it's important to say that not everybody there shares that view. The real estate market, surprising to me at least, did not tank, and there was interest in people moving there even afterwards. That might be on speculation because maybe prices had fallen, but there was a desire there, and there is a desire in the community among many to move beyond this and show the world that they're strong and resilient. And I just don't want that to be lost in this conversation either, but there's a real palpable fear that hangs over that.
Yeah, no, that is very true. And I guess I get caught up in like talking to the people who are just, you know, in the worst state or just feeling that way. But yeah, I think that's of course important to mention. I think the mayor has been very just positive and really tries to do his best, you know, in this situation.
I think he's learned some lessons.
Yeah. But I wanted to bring up, you know, the regulation. So I think, you know, that's, you know, a lot, we've heard from a lot of people that, you know, it's essentially, you know, we did our whole investigation, how there's essentially, you know, a lack of regulation. So when they when they released the preliminary report, it explained how they were passing first wayside detectors, and the wayside detector is what detects the heating of the wheel. So they went through the first one, then the second one, and the third one, and the temperature kept increasing. And I will say, when J.D. Vance and Sherrod Brown sponsored the Railway Safety Act, I think there was kind of two sides of it. One side is, you know, this is the first, you know, this is something. This is a way that they're trying to implement something. But when you really read it, when I kind of looked at it and like thought about exactly the miles of the wayside detectors in the East Palestine situation, what they were proposing, they said there has to be a two-person crew. There was a two-person crew in East Palestine. They said that the wayside detectors have to be like 10 to 50 miles apart. But they were meeting that requirement. In that, you know?
It was the increase in the temperature that didn't require, I mean, there was, I don't remember what the percentage was, but it was something like a 90% increase in temperature from one reading to the next. They just simply had a threshold that was up to here, so the fact that it was rapidly increasing wasn't factored in at all. It just didn't hit that yet. By the next one, it was way too late.
Yeah, so the idea there was that nothing would have changed that situation in terms of what they were proposing. So,
and the fact that it hasn't passed yet and it's just been reintroduced this week by Amelia Sykes and Mike Ruley in the House this is where the politics get interjected into it a bit. Because first of all, the way that it's written, which is not unusual for an act of Congress, is it's not long on specifics. It's long on telling department heads to study and come up with regulations, and not a lot of specific regulations. And that changes from administration to administration. So for instance, Sean Duffy probably has a different view of rail safety than Pete Buttigieg had, or whoever the next transportation secretary is. And then the other thing is people getting along and getting their information straight and not spinning for political purposes. I mentioned Mike Ruley's a co-sponsor of this version of the Rail Safety Act. Mike Ruley at the time wasn't at any of these news conferences we're talking about, despite being in the state Senate, and he was on Fox News being dishonest about the federal agencies that he said weren't there when we knew they were there, but he wasn't there. He wasn't at any of those conferences. But then, now this week, J.D. Vance was back in East Palestine, and when discussing the Rail Safety Act, he said he thinks it has a better shot this time because Republicans control the Senate, and he thinks that the only reason it didn't pass before was because then Majority Leader Chuck Schumer didn't bring it to the floor. In reality, while that is true, it's incredibly misleading because Ted Cruz and John Thune, two Republicans, were holdout votes who would not vote for it, and so if it had been brought to the floor, it would have failed, and John Thune is the majority leader now. So not only does he have to bring it to the floor once it gets introduced in the Senate, he has to completely change his mind about it. So we're getting nowhere, is my point, because now we're bogged down in this political minutia, and these people aren't getting what they need.
And Vance also did critique it again, though. And I remember a long time ago when I interviewed him about it, a year ago, whenever that was, he was like, yeah, look, it's not perfect, but like this is the best that we can do. But during the press conference, he did say, he's like, I think it could be better.
Sure.
So, he was one of the people that was agreeing that it wasn't, that great. Whereas I remember Sherrod Brown seemed to like, he seemed to be more into it and was like, yeah, this is great. So, I mean, these issues, I do feel like it's not like Republican Democrat thing. It's really just, I don't know. I don't really know what the reasoning is behind it. But I was going to say something and I forgot a few minutes ago.
Well, but it certainly, it shouldn't be a Republican Democrat thing, but that gets interjected and it does become that. You mentioned Sherrod Brown being all for it at the time, and I suspect he was, but my guess is that was a Democratic administration, and he had a lot of faith in that transportation secretary to do what he thought should be done, right?
Yeah, so I was also going to say, because I remember we were wondering why it wasn't very specific in the bill, and I remember I was looking things up and asking people questions, and it's like that because they give the authority to the Federal Railroad Administration, and there's some involvement with FSMA but when you look at who makes up the Federal Railroad Administration, which is a very small entity actually, it is people who work for the railroads.
Right.
So I just think that's important to mention.
It is. It's incredibly important to mention because it's not just politics the way you think about it. It's also industry influence.
Yeah, and the fact that, I think just playing the devil's advocate is that railroads and transportation as a whole is what makes our country run. And the reason why the United States is so successful, I think, is because if they were very regulated, what cost would that be? So, I think I'm just saying, like, I think this is kind of where we are in the United States, and it would take a transition and a smart one to be like, okay, like these things need to be regulated so that we can save lives, but not completely, make every train stop every 5 minutes and do an inspection, because they're like, no, we can't do that. So there's got to be a middle ground, and I think that's what people are fighting for.
It'd be interesting to see if there's a comparison, and we haven't done this, but to other countries. We've compared state to state, but like you mentioned that the United States does so well. The United States doesn't do very well by most measures. I mean, it's not really number one in anything, and I don't know if there's other countries that have figured this out better than we have. And so that'd be an interesting thing to look ahead to. Corey, you look like you were going to say something.
Yeah, kind of going back to what she said, I think during those NTSB hearings, relayed a lot of information. A lot of the oxyvinyls who, and a lot of people don't know either, too, is some companies lease these cars. Like Norfolk Southern doesn't own all of these cars; they lease them out to some of. So Oxyvinyl is one of those, and it's like a company. It's like Norfolk Southern, and it's not just Norfolk Southern. This prompted stories with CSX and the bridge in Newton Falls and other derailments. I think it more or less opened our eyes. But going back to Norfolk Southern, you're competing against other industry like the CSX, the other railroads too, who they might look at it and say, well, if we have to stop our trains more time for checks, these companies are going to be like, well, I can get my product there quicker, I can get it there cheaper, because now I don't have to pay a maintenance guy, I don't have to pay all these costs, I don't have to worry about it. So that we talk about the operating costs having been at a smaller scale in proportion to what they've ever been, yet the revenue has been climbing. So it's Norfolk Southern could easily be looking at the next door neighbor and saying, well, hey, if we don't do this, we're not going to keep up. What do we do in this situation? But
somewhere there's a balance, because Norfolk Southern is a $52 billion company. So if they're looking at their neighbor and worried about losing $3 or $4 billion, it's all relative to public safety. And I don't know that we've done anything to figure out what that balance is.
And one other thing too, exactly what you were saying, Corey, when they want to make a profit, they also have to show that profit to investors, and that's how they also get invested in. Sure. Like on Wall Street. So I heard about how, they're a 50-something billion-dollar company and everything, but they look at their budget forecasts like long term, and I guess like sometimes it doesn't look so great, even if they are a $1 billion company, and that's how they get invested in. So it's just really interesting, like complicated, but a reason why they try so hard to save money. And I think, and because when you mentioned earlier about the U.S. like doesn't do that great, but from what I understand is like they do transport a lot of chemicals.
Yes.
And we transport a lot, and we do, there is a lot of manufacturing here and goods and services and a lot of things going on here that I think plays a role in the need for it to be done quickly.
Sure, yeah. I mean, and that's in strictly economic terms, but we're talking about what the balance is when is it, profit over people, and,
Right,
and
right,
where do you
yeah.
strike that balance? Because I think if you ask the CEOs of any of these companies point blank, is money more important than the lives of people? They're not going to say yes, but they might act like it is. And
Right.
so that's the balance that needs struck.
Right. Yeah. And I'm not saying that's my, of course,
Sure.
I would think every, good person believes like people over profit, but, but, I think I like to think of like the whys. I'm like, why aren't they doing it? Why aren't
Yes.
they doing it? And I just like, and I mean, obviously like we would never, we would never say or like report and speculate and be like, oh, they believe in the profit over the people. But when you just follow the money, it's,
Some of the actions beg that question, right?
So I'd like to just kind of go back to moving forward. One of the things
Yes.
from the Louisiana trip that we learned, and then they all talked about this because there wasn't many people that we found in Livingston, Louisiana right now that even remember that train derailment. Now it's been 40 years. Time
Right.
can heal all wounds, so to speak, but you don't see any remnants of it. And they talked about it. It's going to take East Palestine about a decade. It's going to take 10 years to get over this, but they are going to get over it because when you look at the town now, it looks fine. They're thriving. They've got schools. And so I think that was one of the biggest thing that I came back with from people there. They were like, you know what, we feel for people in East Palestine, but if there's anything we can let them know or tell them is you're going to be okay. And I think it was that hope. It was that hope that they were trying to provide, that things are going to get better. I want to say it had been only a few years since we were there that they finally stopped testing for water and they were able to get out of the clear for all that. And so it is going to take a lot of time. And I think the positivity we're seeing from the mayor now and everyone else is that, we're going to be fine. East Palestine may be even better, once we
And in
get down
Livingston,
the
there's
road.
a park there now, correct?
There is a park now.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
But it took a long time to
It
get
does.
there.
It'll take a long time.
So,
Right.
I mean, to wrap up, I'd like to just, and I mean, obviously, we've out for as long as we've been going here, we've barely scratched the surface of some of the details here. But I do want to take a look ahead. Madison, you mentioned the whys. One big one that is coming to my mind here is, look, we can discuss, profit versus people and that sort of thing, but there are some obvious things that everybody's expressed agreement for that still haven't happened. The one that sticks in my mind is the labeling of a high hazard train. So to remind everybody, a high hazard train, the one in East Palestine wasn't considered one despite having some of the most toxic chemicals on the face of the planet on it, because most of the cars didn't have those toxic chemicals, as if the whole train derails, you don't
Right.
still have this horrible problem. Now everybody, when that was brought to Mike DeWine's attention, he couldn't even believe it and said that was ridiculous. That's not a political thing. That shouldn't be an industry thing. Nobody seems to understand why you can't label a train carrying high hazardous
Yeah.
material a high hazard train and make it be checked more often. What are your guys's, just what are the questions you still have or things that you
Yeah.
think are still unresolved?
I just want to add one thing to what you
Sure.
just said. The high hazard train thing also has to do with they're considered high hazard when the train cars are so old, it's made out of a certain material, and they've called for them to switch the materials of how the trains are made. And we've reported about this switch,
Yeah,
but
like the aluminum that can melt and things like that.
yeah, and just it's sort of like the transition into these specific type of train cars, and that has been long called for. So when I found that out too, on top of the fact that it's not considered high hazard because of the number, also high hazard has to do with the integrity of that train car. So I thought that was interesting. But my questions are, I am interested. I think, they said that they're doing health testing, but there's also I'm wondering what kind of studies are being done right now and what they're being used for. And I'd like to know exactly, because they did say there was some sort of conducting of study done. I know now we have a new administration, but also people are calling on for,
Right. Several were commissioned that Biden announced when he was here. There's another one ongoing now. There could be more. There are ongoing studies. We don't really know. I mean, and for that matter, Norfolk was doing those too. We don't really know what they were doing with it. They were going door to door. They were taking information. But what's the end game there? I mean, is this just to document it so you know what the effect is? Or is this to offer some help if there's a problem? We don't know that.
Yeah, I would really like to know that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, going back to rail safety, I mean, that's probably the big question. Where does that go from here? Because that's still the big question. Where does this Rail Safety Act go? She talked about, Vice President Vance talking about, that it could be improved, it could be better. So what does that look like, and what will it look like now, sitting in front of a different coalition? So.
And I would also really like to know what the new EPA director, Lee Zeldin, what he's going to do. I think I do remember, Michael Regan and I think the EPA is, they're a branch of the government, so they don't make all the calls and they have, bosses and stuff. But I feel like he was very, I remember him, having a hard time answering some of the questions. And there was questioning him over the transparency and him not being able to answer a lot of things. And I only heard this Mr. Zeldin man speak for maybe a minute. He really didn't speak long, and of course, it was very political, him saying, oh, I see it's a big priority. But I'm just interested to see, because they really, in my opinion, I think, compared to some of the leadership we've seen come down in the past couple of years, they made some pretty strong promises. It didn't have meat to it, because there was no.
You're talking this week on Monday?
They said we are never ever going to. They're we promise we're going to do the health studies. We promise you we are not going to leave you behind. We're going to do all of these things. Now, obviously, in 4 years, an administration changes, but.
And what does that look like? Not leaving you behind is not specific.
Well, that's what I'm saying is they do. I think after what they said, I'm interested to see what it is they really do.
Right, because you do have, this is just getting back to the politics of it. You do have an administration that is more industry friendly now, as opposed to, and they don't like regulation. So if we're talking about regulation, I don't know what they may endorse.
Yeah.
Lee Zeldin in particular has been very hostile to environmental causes. He is not somebody who would suggest from his background that he wants to do more to stop this. He's more likely to want to strip regulation away, but we don't know what he's going to do.
And it is kind of interesting, because we also had, some of our, Democratic leaders or whoever, saying the water's safe and people drinking the water. And now, of course, we have an industry-friendly administration kind of siding with people saying, though, we hear your concerns. So I'm just interested to see what it is that they do and, what kind of a message that's going to send.
Right. Where will the rubber meet the road on, what does it look like to not leave them behind? Yeah.
And if things are going great, what do they do?
Yes.
Unless people continue to, make waves and speak up and talk about the things that are going on, they may just kind of get pushed to the side. I don't know.
I've gotten a sense from some of the people in East Palestine that I talk to or follow on social media that they don't care. I know that they're a red area and there gets to be politics, but they don't care. I can think of one particular, one of the plaintiffs in one of the lawsuits who is unabashedly very progressive on almost every issue, but was very open to what Vance was going to say this week, because her position was J.D. Vance has listened and been there for us. Now, I don't know that she was particularly impressed with Monday because it wasn't real specific, and he did kind of backpedal on some of what he'd promised in the past, like the Stafford Act, providing health care, things like that. But again, a senator is his own boss. Now he's working for someone else. So we don't know how that's going to play out.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see, yeah.
It definitely will.
Yeah.
Anybody want to add anything else before we wrap up this supersized edition of the Outcue?
But I just want to say it is interesting when you see people come together and not care about either sides when you see that that person is helping with your issue. Because even remember, I'm thinking about the Delphi salaried retirees for some reason,
Absolutely.
but the way that, they were just hoping that Sherrod Brown, counting on him at the time, and Biden, when we asked him that question that one time, so yeah, it is true. In East Palestine, that's considered a red, very red community, but they just want whoever's going to be there and listen.
Absolutely. They want to not be used as props. They want real answers and they want real solutions. That's it.
Yeah, and just kind of, reiterating too that anybody who had to make a decision, especially on a local level like Mayor Conaway and Keith Drabick, that's like that's a tough situation. Like no one ever signs up thinking like there's no trade.
Yeah.
But that set the precedent for things you have to be, wary of now. Like if you live along a railway or you live along a major mode of transportation, anything. Like it just opens your eyes to what can happen, and it's just, like you said, you do what you can. But like you said, there's been learning lessons all through.
Well, and as journalists, I think it's helped us ask questions that are unrelated. For instance, they opened the Ultium Cells plant in Lordstown, and I don't know prior that we would have thought to say, hey, are the fire crews, are they trained for the specific chemicals that are in that building? But that was a big question, and this trained us to know to ask that kind of question.
Right. Yeah, and as journalists, we don't care what side of the aisle anyone is on. We just want the truth.
Absolutely, exactly. And we haven't seen a ton of truth throughout the course of covering East Palestine. We've seen some spin and some truth, and we've seen some people who just want public service. They don't want politics.
Same with realty, too.
It is exactly the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, the NTSB coming to your community more than once in a couple of years.
Can I just add one more thing? It's weird because I've seen just the way that the EPA responds, just a lot of similarities with the Realty Tower, East Palestine, Sobe, and the PFAS story I did, which are all directly stories related to EPA permitting things, and they all have to do with transportation. I'm just saying, there's just a lot of, so it's been interesting to be working here these past 4.5 years now, and these instances have happened, and it's all, like, it's kind of weird.
Well, I think that what we found in a lot of this is that whatever industry you're talking about regulating, there might be a lot of regulations, but it's layers of Swiss cheese, and there's a lot of holes in those regulations. So it's words on paper, but there's not a lot of teeth to much of it. They're basically unregulated industries when you get through all of that.
Right, and they just get like some small fines.
And what was the number that Jennifer Homendy told you, like the number of recommendations?
Like 150?
Right, and then how many were implemented?
Or did she, at one point I know she had a number that said like 500, or I know what you're talking about.
It was like
She's
very
like,
few.
It was a lot, and she was like, we have blank
have all
recommendations,
this.
and how many, not, so they do all these recommendations, and they don't, as we've reported many times, they don't have all the power, and then, but yeah, they, I think the NTSB is definitely a fascinating, so is she still?
She is.
Okay, so they don't get to decide.
I guess that's unknowable right now. There's a whole lot of positions that are not political appointees and are supposed to transcend, but we've seen a lot of them get fired in the past 2 weeks because this is an administration that is getting rid of non-political positions that they don't see as loyal. So we don't know if she's going to stay, but she's supposed to stay.
Right. Yeah. It's the NTSB has, been obviously a very important player in all these situations. So.
And so I think for the people there, they need to keep on their elected officials for any concerns that they still have, because there's, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, there's a definite sense to keep the economy moving and move on from this, and they will if they're allowed to, and if the people don't keep commenting and letting them know that they have concerns until those concerns are answered.
Sure.
And to that end, when you have concerns or things we should look into or questions that you have, whether it be stories that we should look into or questions you have about how we've done news stories, That's what we're here for, and we are always here because we are public servants, and we are here to serve you. And without an agenda, as Madison said earlier, this is about the truth. We are about getting at the truth, and we are about cutting through anybody who's not getting at the truth. So if you're having trouble or wondering about what the truth about something is, we're the people you reach out to. And you can reach us at 330-744-8821. You can reach us at news@wfmj.com, watchdog@wfmj.com. You can message us on Facebook Messenger. You can message us on Blue Sky. And you should always like, subscribe, and follow to the Outcue and to the WFMJ YouTube channel and everywhere else that you can find us. Download our app, and we're here for you. You be here for us. Until next week, this has been the Outcue.